I know I like said some stuff that I know is going to get cut.
Oh, a lot of
Uh,
it's gonna get
yeah,
cut.
but
This episode was 6 minutes long.
yeah. Welcome to Why Is This Good? A podcast by the Naples Writers Workshop. I'm Christine and I'm here with John. Hey, John.
Hello.
Okay, it's my turn. And I picked a story called Woman at Exhibition by E. Lily Yu, who we have featured before
Very recently, too.
very recently.
Yeah. Cartographer wasps and anarchist bees.
Yes. Did you pick that one?
You picked that one, yeah.
It took me forever to like remember the name even. I was like, I feel like I know her name. What did she write? What did she write? And I just like it wasn't until I had read it twice that I like looked her up again and I was like, oh shit. Because I knew that she was a sci-fi writer. She writes in that vein a lot. This is weird. So this is another one by her. I forget how I found it. It's the way I've been finding everything. And I had not read it, but I skimmed, I think, to the point where I saw that she eats this painting. It's about a woman that eats a painting. Okay. At the end of the room, she came to La Pont Royal. Estelle studied the smooth Seine, the high-roofed pavilion de flore, the bridge arcing into the gilt baguette frame. The painting was slightly broader than her shoulders, warm as an embrace, and it smacked of youth's blunt, determined mimicry. Nothing in it foreshadowed the stormy colors and geometries to the older Hopper. He might have been pleasant to kiss at that age, she thought. As she stood there considering the creamy canvas, she discovered that she was hungry. No, not hungry, but starving. Her stomach twisted with want. Without comprehending what she did or why, knowing only that her need was urgent and overwhelming, Estelle stepped forward and bit into La Pont Royale. The 100-year-old canvas yielded to her teeth. She gripped the frame tightly and chewed and tore. Her mouth filled with thick, bitter chips. Butter, river blue, shingle, cloud, sky. Distantly, as if through a fog, she could hear shouting. Hands seized her shoulders, but Estelle clutched the painting and ate and ate. Not until she had swallowed half the canvas did she come to herself. The white walls, the wooden floor, the heavy smell of linseed, the hubbub of voices, all crashed in upon her senses. Estelle licked her lips, tasted metal, and gagged. Her teeth were coated with powder. Dried paint flecked her blouse, mouth, and chin. The remnants of La Pont Royal hung sadly in their frame, still attached to the wall. Okay, so like I said, I hadn't read it, but when I realized that that's what happened, I was like, cool, I'm on board. When you first read it, you don't know why she does this. It just seems like one of those intrusive thoughts. And I think we've all had intrusive thoughts like that.
Yeah.
And it's not like, what if I ate the painting? But it's more like, what if I did this horrible thing? You know, like,
Yeah.
especially in places like museums or wherever where it's like, it's supposed to be like some kind of decorum.
Yeah. Somebody comes up and says, "You're standing too close to that painting."
Right.
You're like, "I'm gonna eat it."
You're like, I'm doing something.
The way she described it, though, it's a creamy canvas. What was the other? There was another word in there, but it was described in a very delectable way.
Yes.
I was like, I know why you're eating that canvas.
Yeah, it does sound good. I would go for that. So I was kind of like in because of that. And then I didn't really know where the story was going to go. And I don't really think I expected it to go where it went, you know?
No, it's inevitable, though. It's a
Is it?
surprise, but it's inevitable.
I don't know. This one was so weird to me. I liked it by the end. I think you didn't read the interview with her, but she does an interview in this magazine when it's published to talk about Hopper and his wife and their
Oh,
real
yeah.
art.
That's what I was
Yeah.
curious about. I was curious about
Yeah.
how real.
Yeah, apparently like this is pretty accurate from what I remember in terms of like the fact that they're married and they both paint and like all wives, she's the lesser known. And the interview talks a lot about how even if you don't read the interview, you can appreciate from this story that Estelle, the main character, is married to a fellow musician, right? They're both artists. And at the very beginning, he basically kicks her out of the house so he can work
Oh,
on his
man.
shit. He's like, well, I got to do mine. And she's like, okay, I guess I'll do mine somewhere else.
That beginning with him and
Yeah.
like how he's like
He's a
being so
jerk.
mean to her and so rude.
I
And then
know.
she's like, he kissed her on the cheek or something and she's just melted. And I was like,
Yeah,
oh, you
I
poor
know.
woman.
Estelle. Yeah, she's like, oh, I love him. So yeah, he prizes his own work over hers, even though they're like in the same field. It's terrible. And it's bizarre too that the person closest to you who, you know, he probably on some level likes that she does what he does, but you kind of realize it's not because he thinks what she does is good. It's just that maybe she understands his work better. You know what I mean? And maybe he's not directly worried about any kind of like competition, but all of that kind of plays into the Hoppers. So Edward Hopper's better known, obviously, than his wife. I didn't even know he had one until I was reading this. And I'm familiar with these paintings that they're talking about. So there's like all of the comparisons between the types of work that they do and like. And then by the end, it's where it's like takes this like sci sci-fi turn. And I read it twice and I still don't know that I totally get it. But it seems like the curator of this area, and is she at a cafe or a museum?
A cafe. They're at
I
a
thought that she
museum.
was like it sounded like she was like there to like eat.
She was on her way somewhere and she saw the thing and was like,
She
well, I've
stopped
just been
there.
staring at Nighthawks, so I'm going to go look at these other paintings because, it's so interesting. And then while she's there, maybe she was on her way to a cafe and it didn't satisfy her hunger. And that's why she ate the painting. And then the woman who was basically the resident
Oh,
expert
yeah.
dragged her into an office.
Yeah, this is I think where I got confused because right before she like looks at the painting, she says she like recounts this flashback where like her and Luke are talking on a
Oh,
trip that they were
yes.
on, and she looks down into her cup, and the next one is like in the center of the room. So it's like it's
Yes.
disembodying that way. I remember thinking like, wasn't she just like eating and drinking, and then she's there? So I couldn't at first. I wasn't sure like where this was. Okay, but that doesn't matter. I was wrong. So yes, they're in a museum, and so she just like goes to like kill time there, and when the curator takes her back, like you said, the curator's like, everyone that sees this happen and the cops and the security guards, whatever, they're all like, okay, like we're ready to do our part. And the lady's like, no, I need to talk to this woman. This is bizarre, but also she seems to know a little bit more about it. She's more than curious about why Estelle did this. It seems like she's like finally recognized someone else that like has seen something. She's not just like, let me talk to the mad woman. She's like, no, I want to have a private conversation with her. And then it seems like by the end, she's kind of revealing to her that not everyone can even see Joe Hopper's work. Like it doesn't
Yes.
exist to most people. And if Estelle saw it,
Because you ate that painting, you can
yeah.
see it.
Yeah. And she's describing or showing her other works. And she's like, except they don't exist. And
Yeah.
Estelle's like, what do you mean?
They all like turned to like char. They said this whole portfolio
Yeah.
was burned, but you got to see them as vivid, bright, new paintings because you ate that other one. And so
Yeah.
I got to give you this opportunity to see them before you leave,
Go on with
because
your life. Yeah.
otherwise,
She wanted
you
you to
will have
see them.
eaten that painting for nothing.
Yeah, you'll have eaten that painting for nothing. And also, it seems like that curator was trying to like pass on this message from Joe. She's kind of like, you were given this opportunity. And so, like, we have to see it through before you go home. And the curator doesn't get to really know Estelle, it doesn't seem like. So the connection is never really like directly made for the reader. But you can kind of know by the end,
Yeah.
just from that brief thing that we see at the beginning with the husband, it's like, for Estelle, if she was driven to madness, to eat that painting, it's probably because her husband's being a real dick. And she probably feels a lot like this Joe Hopper.
Yeah.
And I thought it was just like so perfectly done. It's nice and short. We don't have to like read this long drawn out thing where like something happens after this. You can just kind of assume she goes home and like tells her husband she had a nice afternoon, and he doesn't ask anyway. So who cares?
Yeah, he doesn't care.
Yeah, I know. He'll never know about this.
You wanted a ring? I got you a ring. You're in charge of everything else.
Yeah, like she's trying to plan this wedding, and you kind of hope that like she'll come to her senses, but I think it's like, I don't know. I like that we don't see her like even revisit the husband. We don't even see her reflect on that necessarily. It's just that moment at the end, and the curator's a woman too, which I think is kind of key, right? It almost passes that like Bechdel test or whatever, where like women are talking about something other than a man. I mean, they're talking about Joe, but they're only talking about it in context of Ed. But anyway, I think it's key that the curator's a woman too, because she's like probably looking at her, and if she knows enough about Joe Hopper, she maybe is making these leaps. But I just kind of like how it doesn't even show Estelle go back to her home life. It's just like at the end, all that's like left on the page that you're kind of wondering about is this thing that she almost says about Joe.
Just one more thing about Joe. The door had already closed.
Yes. And it doesn't matter what that is.
It was an interesting ending, right?
Yeah.
The whole thing about like, you're obviously not allowed to ever come back in here, even though I gave you this amazing experience of being able to see these paintings, and like, you ate the painting. You're not allowed back.
You're a criminal.
I respect what you did.
Yeah. It's so weird.
This is like one of those things we talked about making connections, right? Like the narrative can make the connections for you. The character doesn't have to make them.
Yeah, I feel like I've talked about that recently in my workshop, where it's like your character can fall on one end of the spectrum in terms of their self-awareness, but unless you've like made it kind of explicit for the reader, it can be kind of painful to read. Unless like the disembodied narrator is making it apparent enough that like this is the connection that the character is even supposed to reach or like see.
Well, yeah, the character, like this story, she doesn't have to consciously make those connections for us, but we can see them. And there's a reason that E. Lily Yu put the first section in. She didn't start at the museum. She started with the strange little exchange at home that got her to the museum. And
Right.
so why did she connect those two things? There's a
Right.
connection there.
It still works because E. Lily Yu has done that work for us in engineering this story and starting it where she did and giving us the information we know about Hopper, about the wife, about Estelle, all of that kind of stuff. It makes it less about a weird thing where a lady like suddenly eats a painting and then like gets to go into the Joe Hopper portal, and more about you needed this experience because this is happening to you in real time. And what's great about it is how quickly she achieved that. All we needed to see is this husband be like kind of callous toward her and boot her out. You know, it's so brief, that kind of introduction that sets the scene. So I think it's also like a really good example of like how quickly you can set up a story and just get into it. This read so fast, and it's
Yeah.
because it's like purely dialogue.
It's 4,000 words, but it felt more like
Like
almost flash fiction.
1,500. Yeah. When I sat down to reread it, I was like, I don't want to reread. I was like, oh wow, that was quick. Like because it's just there's nothing to it, and it starts where it needs to start. It ends where it needs to end. It still does this weird sci-fi thing. I hate stories that are like I had to keep thinking about it after the fact to figure it out. No, not about that. But I like stories that make me keep thinking about them because they've introduced something that seems really important that I'm fascinated by. I hate when people are like, oh, I really had to think about that, and then when I thought about it, I figured it out. I'm like, dude, if you had to think that hard about a story, something was wrong, and I don't think it's your brain. I think it's the story. When revelations happen off page, all the writer did was introduce a concept to you, and any conclusion that you've reached is your own. And I don't know that it was the intention. I hate when people are like, I want to make people think. I'm like, no, you want to make people struggle. You don't have anything to say.
Yeah, there's a difference between, like, I think about that story, the Cheever story, the swimmer, where he goes to all the
Yes.
pools. And a lot of people said, well, what does that mean? What does the visiting of all those pools mean? Like, the story is literally about him swimming in different pools. Like, that's what happens in the story. And time passes in a very strange way. And then it ends. And you can think about that and be like, well, that could mean this and that could mean that, or I can apply it to this situation, or it kind of represents this kind of like journey of whatever. And that's fine. That means you're thinking about the story. It's like, that's what you want to do with the story. But the
Yeah.
story itself is very well done. And so people, what they do is they look at that kind of thing and they're like, I want the story. What I want from the story is for people to think about it when they're done. I don't want them to just turn the last page and say, oh, it's a good story, and then forget it. I want them to like have to think about it. And so they believe somehow that means you have to make it confusing so that
Yeah.
they need to do work and think about it for the next couple of hours after they finish to figure out what really happened in your story. And
Yeah.
that's not true. Like what really happened in the swimmer is very obvious.
Yeah.
But you can do with it what you want when you're done.
Yeah.
It's the same in here. What happened in here is so obvious. It's like easy to see.
It's right there.
And it's well presented. It's perfectly cogent.
Yes. It's just anything I'm thinking about afterwards is because she did that so well, not because
Yeah.
she failed to do it.
That's
Yeah,
right.
I don't like having to like interpret something or wonder what happened. Like you said, they also have this tendency to think that they need to confuse you in order for it to be like recognized as being well done somehow. And it's like, I don't need you to be ambiguous about it or like abstract about it. You don't need to hint at these things. You could just fucking tell me. Like, just tell me. I don't have to like
Yeah.
read every sentence and have to figure every fucking sentence out. That is not an enjoyable experience. You know, I think it matters like if you can or can't skim something and just like not get it. When people are like, no, it was there on page 7 in this sentence. And I'm like, well, I checked out for a fraction of a second and I missed it. And other people will too. And I don't care if it's technically there. It's not overarching.
You can't bury it in your boring prose.
That's what I mean. Yeah, it's like a treasure hunt. It's like, no, actually, it's there. See if you can find it. It's like when people, like, no one would read Harry Potter even for like more than a chapter and forget that he's 12.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
like, when you're like reading a book and you're like, how old is this person? And they're like, I told you, she's in college. I said right here. And it's like, right, but you haven't consistently characterized her in a way that makes me understand her. You haven't, like, you know, it's not like I'm being lazy. It's like she doesn't come across like a college kid, you know? Like, you've glossed past that because you don't even have a firm grasp of the story or like character development or whatever. Like, but people just love to quickly say, no, it's there. You weren't paying attention. I'm like, I wasn't paying attention and you suck. Two can be true.
The reason I wasn't paying attention was because your prose bored the hell out of me.
Yeah, it's terrible.
And I was just looking at the words so I could get through it. But I was
Yeah.
thinking about something else. I was thinking about apple pie because apple pie is good.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you
And
know
your
what is
prose
good?
is not.
Apple pie. Yeah. I don't really know what my takeaway would be other than when I finished, I was still thinking about the dynamics between artists. And then also it made me look up the Hopper stuff.
Oh,
And it
yeah.
made me want to read about Joe Hopper. I think there's something really cool when you've landed on something, and I don't think you should just engineer this. I think if there's something that you're personally passionate about, whether it's like, I don't know, the first thing that came to my mind was Garfield the cat. But as a kid, I was also into Garfield the president. I'm in Ohio, right? Birthplace of he was born in my hometown, Menor. Or not born there, but he lived there.
Man, if his doctor had subscribed to the germ theory, he wouldn't have been killed.
Yeah, he would not have been assassinated, successfully at least. So if I'm really into James A. Garfield and how he died, but it's not a common story, that everybody doesn't know that the doctor like fished around in the wound without a glove and killed him.
Yeah. And kept his apron with all the blood on it as a badge of honor.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm a good doctor because this apron
Disgusting.
is covered in other people's blood.
Yeah, he literally lived for like another month with this
Yeah.
wound. He died a slow, horrible death. Anyway, if I'm enamored by that story and I think it's like something I think about all the time, it's not. But like maybe I know a little bit more than anyone else that's listening right now. This much more. If it's something that like you can introduce somehow, or if there's something to do with that you want to introduce to your story, that is an example of something that I think will make people think to themselves, that's that story that made me go and read about James A. Garfield, the president. And
Yeah.
something like this is cool because she could have invented an artist. She could have known about the Hoppers and still invented artists whose paintings don't exist on Google for me to revisit. And I don't think it's lazy for her to just like do it of real art, you know?
No, it's great.
And it's great to just like draw those conclusions. I don't even know how hard she had to really think to draw those conclusions because maybe everybody knows about the Hoppers that, this was the common threat in their marriage, their competing careers. And she's just the first person that's written about it in this way. And it's cool because now I'm thinking about that. So I think that's just like, you can write about whatever you want, but if you want to introduce something like factual, whether it's like a cool little tidbit or a real person's history, whatever you want to do, whatever parallels you draw or themes you come up with, I think it's a cool way to get people to kind of tune in a little bit more, to like pay attention a little bit more.
Learn something.
Yeah, I know. And like, it's different than had she written a first person story about a real artist that actually ate a painting. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about like, write something factual. This is still sci-fi. It's still fantastic. It's still weird, but it's rooted in something true that I can then go and explore. And that's just a neat thing to kind of do. So not all sci-fi has to be something, not all fantasy or whatever. Any of this like speculative stuff, there's always truth to it. And that's why we like it, right? There's always something real that you can go and be interested in.
Yeah. I'd like to point out to the listeners of this podcast who do not get to see the video that there's a shelf full of Garfields sitting behind Christine right now.
Yeah. Not the president, it's the cat. I love the cat for real. Yeah. Oh wow. Thanks, Sean. So what's your takeaway?
My takeaway is I don't know what to do with this takeaway.
Okay.
But when I read the moment when she's like, I'm just reading the story, it's like, I know it's an uncanny magazine and it's not supposed to be like just regular fiction, like literary fiction, or whatever. But I was reading it that way because it's just like this couple talking and then she goes to a museum. Then she ate a painting. And I was like, this is great. I love this moment. So my takeaway is just like, make your characters eat paintings. Like this is such a great thing to do. I like that so much. It's something that makes people sit up. It's something that you pull the book closer to your face. So you want to just get into the story more.
Yeah.
And like I said, I don't know what to do with that. Like, I'm just going to let my characters go, and that's like my takeaway is just let my characters go.
It's that intrusive thought. We've all had them. I have them all the time. And yeah, it's just kind of like, what if I did that? And then it's like, oh my gosh, she actually had them do that. And it was so much cooler. It takes you places.
It doesn't have to be the weird, like science fiction-y kind of thing or a weird, like suddenly my character morphed into a bear and started like drinking tea. Whatever it is, like it could be realistic, but it could be not something people do normally, right? Like, but just letting your characters go, like they don't have to be shy about like who they are. Let them do with the things, and the story can follow up what happens. Like Nettie in that story and the swimmer, he went to every pool, and then every time he got to a different pool, somebody was like, "What are you doing?"
Right.
And so you play that out.
I think this is like the closest I can when people say that they like invent a character and the character is so strong that they're just doing things on the page. They just like let the character act. I've never had that where I'm like, oh yeah, the character. Yeah. Oh, I was just inspired. No, like I'm always like having to think really hard. But I think what's cool about this example of it is that when you do lean into something like outlandish like this intrusive thought, it's just like the stuff that follows after. You're coming up with it still, but it's kind of like like, it allows you to say, like, what if this happened? And now you're playing it through. You're playing through something that, like, you wouldn't have otherwise entertained on the page. It's something so ridiculous. And that's the closest I think I've ever come to, like, feeling like the story's telling itself or the characters acting on their own, right? It's when you introduce something and then you have to really think, like, what would happen next in this scenario? Well, you could easily envision it. In this scenario, she gets in trouble. Everyone freaks the fuck out. She gets called into an office, almost arrested. And then everything that happens after that is kind of like, something that the reader or the writer had in mind before she started it. But if you're looking to just kind of like do something, yeah, it's like lean into the ridiculous and the absurd and you'll figure it out.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be something you discover as you're writing. It can be part of your outline.
Yes.
My whole story is based around somebody doing something crazy and weird. And then you figure out, well, where'd they come from? How does the story start? What happens next? And then you outline it. Then you can write it and you create a character that the character that would do that becomes your character. It's not something you have to discover in the moment.
Right.
But whichever way it happens.
Yeah, whichever way it happens. It's just kind of like, if you don't have a story idea, think of something crazy.
There you go. That's perfect.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks, guys. If you enjoyed this episode, consider joining our Patreon. Your support helps us keep the show running. Find out more at patreon.com/whyisthisgoodpodcast. And for industry news, writing tips, and great short fiction, join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Naples Writers Workshop. You can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter at napleswritersworkshop.com.